Hi, ladies. I'm sorry that I am not able to be there with you today, in part because we're going to start off Unit 3, which is actually one of my favorite units. This is a subject area, metabolism, that I'll be honest is very challenging and might be the most challenging thing we do. However, I think once we get into this stuff, it's actually kind of enjoyable. You just have to kind of get over that initial shock of how hard it might seem at first, and I promise that we will get you there. The other reason this is one of my favorite things is that I feel like this is not taught well in most high schools, including my own experience. And that comes back to bite most students when they get to college because the expectation is that you really know metabolism in your biology classes. But I'm proud to say that the thing I hear from graduates the most about is how they did metabolism in their biology class in college, and it was easy because they can remember what they learned in my AP class. So I hope that that is true this year as well. Um, and we begin today on chapter 7, which is about cellular respiration. Then we'll move into chapter 8, which is about photosynthesis. So kicking off October here, got some pictures of my two little kiddos at their first Halloweens, and then my big dog kiddo there. Probably that was his like third Halloween. So we're talking about energy here, as you can see in the essential questions, and that's going to be the theme throughout. Let's start out by looking at a couple things that were actually in chapter 6, which hopefully you had a chance to read since our last class. The first thing to remember is that according to the laws of thermodynamics, right, energy transformation is imperfect and it leads to an increase in entropy or disorder. Um, you can think of this like a system that you don't intentionally keep up is going to kind of fall apart, right? And you can look at that from all different aspects. I mean, think about a house maybe in your neighborhood, or hopefully there's not any in your neighborhood like this, but a house where the people just don't take care of it, right? They don't cut the grass, they don't take care of the landscaping, they don't take care of everything on the outside of the house. And after a while, the house starts to look really crummy, right? This is like a living system. If you don't put energy into keeping up, it starts to break apart, and that's what entropy is. Another good example is just if you think of your own room, right? Let's say your parents tell you have to clean up your room tonight before you can go out with your friends. So you put a bunch of energy into it, you put all your things away, right? You put clothes back in the closet, whatever else you might have laying around, you put away, and your room looks real nice, right? Now, if we fast forward 3 weeks and you haven't intentionally kept your room really nice and neat, there's probably going to be a bunch of stuff laying around again, right? Clothes on the floor, shoes on the floor, whatever it might be. Until you put energy back into it and you clean things up again. Put the clothes away, make your bed, whatever it might be. Now, this is why a living system needs a constant input of energy, right? We need energy to come in constantly so that we maintain order and we don't see this entropy or this disorder in our system. Because, as it says here in the middle, in a living system, if it becomes disordered, you're dead, right? So if your cells don't get new energy to serve as the energy to make reactions go, then the reactions don't happen and the cells will die. So we need this constant influx of energy, and we need a way to use that energy once it gets into your body. All of the different biochemical processes that allow us to use energy are a part of your metabolism. And your metabolism is really made of two parts. You have a catabolism, or catabolic reactions, that break things down. And then you have sets of anabolic reactions, or an anabolism, that builds things up. Right? And then ATP. We've mentioned ATP this year a couple times already. Now we're really going to get to know it better. ATP is the energy source for all of these reactions, the catabolic reactions and the anabolic reactions. So obviously you need a lot of ATP. The question becomes, why ATP? Why do we need this particular type of energy versus the foods we eat and things like that? Now, before you freak out, this is not an illustration that you need to learn or to really know hardly any of. But this is an illustration of your metabolism that Dr. Wong and I made for his textbook. And it just kind of shows the major components of the metabolism and then also the organs that are involved in those things. And so, as you can see here in this picture, the main hub of your metabolism is your liver. This is where a lot of the reactions take place, heavier than in other parts of your body. You also need some fats involved, so that's what this adipose tissue is here on the left. Notice you need your kidney, but the kidney has a bunch of arrows just leaving it. And that's because the kidney is your waste removal system for any of the waste that you make in your metabolism. The muscles are also a big component and a big part of this. And the muscles are really important because a lot of these same reactions can take place there, whether we're building things up and storing energy in the muscle or we're burning energy from the muscles. Then the last thing you see on here is the brain. And notice arrows go to the brain, but they don't leave the brain. The brain is solely a beneficiary of your metabolism. It gets the results and it gets that energy. And just as we talked a minute ago about how all the reactions need energy to take place, as an organ, your brain needs a constant influx of energy. If it doesn't have that, you are no more. Now, Chapter 7, our focus is going to be on cellular respiration. Cellular respiration has a pretty big, wordy definition here. But ultimately, it's a group or a pathway of catabolic reactions that break down the foods we eat into smaller and simpler products. And when you move it into that smaller and simpler product, we can get some free energy out of the bonds that we break, and we can use that free energy in our cells to do the other reactions that we need. Now, there are two types of respiration that we see in nature. Some organisms can only do one of these types. Other organisms can do both of these types. But the first one is aerobic respiration. And aerobic respiration is going to be our main focus. This is called aerobic because it requires oxygen. Basically, anything that requires oxygen is referred to as aerobic. Like if you think of aerobic exercises, right? They make you breathe harder. They make you require more oxygen. So aerobic respiration will utilize oxygen as a reactant, and it produces the most accessible energy. So you can get quite a bit of energy from aerobic respiration. The other option is called anaerobic respiration. Right? As the word kind of tells you, this is not aerobic, so this does not require energy, it does not require oxygen. But the bad thing is, it also does not lead to as much energy being made, or well, not really made, but as much energy being freed for your cells. If we look at cellular respiration from the chemistry point of view, then technically what we have is a biological combustion, right? A combustion reaction. Take something, add oxygen, it will combust and produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And that's essentially all the catabolic pathway is. You take an organic compound, in our case a carbohydrate, you add oxygen to it, that produces carbon dioxide and water and energy in your cells. Now this is also why we call this respiration, because we got oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. So while we're really not focusing on how you breathe here in AP Biology, this is basically what's going on at the cellular level, is the cell takes in oxygen, gives off carbon dioxide, and at the organism level, you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out that waste carbon dioxide. Now, sticking with the chemistry for a moment, this is an oxidation reduction reaction, right? A redox reaction, in which organic fuels get oxidized to lead to a production of energy. Now, I don't know if our chemistry department uses this mnemonic device to remember this, but I think it's really helpful. So oil rig, right? Oil rig is the way to remember who gets oxidized and who gets reduced and what that means. The OIL stands for oxidation is loss. All right. And the RIG stands for reduction is gain. Oil rig. And what we're talking about here, gaining and losing, are electrons. Right? So if something gets oxidized, in our case, it's going to be your organic compound, your carbohydrate. It will lose electrons because oxidation is loss of electrons. If something gets reduced, in our case, the oxygen, it will be gaining electrons. So reduction is gain of electrons. So oxidation is loss of electrons, reduction is gain of electrons. Whatever member of your reaction is getting oxidized will lose some electrons, and whatever part of your reaction is getting reduced will gain some electrons. Now recall from chapter 6 that in a living system, an electron always basically travels in tandem with a proton. So if you have one electron and one proton, you have a hydrogen atom, right? Now, here's why I bring that up. Chemists would hate for me to say this. I mean, Avogadro is probably like rolling over in his grave right now. But when you look at a reaction, look for the H's to be lost or gained. Right? You don't see the electrons when you look at a reaction, but you do see the H's. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So if you can see that the H is being lost, it's oxidized. If you can see the H is being gained, it's reduced. You want to know that what we're really talking about is gaining and losing electrons. But if the question just asks you which of the following is being oxidized in this reaction, look for the H's and they'll lead you to the right answer. So, skip to the bottom of this real quick. It kind of got messed up a little bit when I transferred this in to explain everything, so I apologize that things are offset a little bit here. Couple different things. This energy should be over here, and they should line up to the arrow. So I'm going to rewrite this down here. The overall chemical reaction for aerobic respiration is glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, 6 O2s, yields 6 CO2s, carbon dioxide, plus 6 waters, H2O, plus energy. And as we'll learn here in a minute, that's going to be ATP. Now, on the last slide, I mentioned that you can follow the H's to figure out what gets oxidized and what gets reduced. So take a look here at this sugar, right? C6H12O6. And what you really want to look at is look at the carbon, right? The carbon, if you follow it to the product side of our reaction, the carbon has lost its hydrogen buddies, right? So if that molecule lost hydrogens, that's an indication that it lost electrons. So the sugar here is what's getting oxidized. Now take a look at the oxygen. Oxygen, if you follow it to the other side of the reaction, gained hydrogen buddies. So if you gain hydrogen, that's an indication that you gained electrons, and the oxygen is being reduced. So again, in a redox reaction, we're really looking at gain and loss of the electrons, but the hydrogen will tell you where those electrons have been gained or lost. And it's a nice little trick to be able to tell who gets oxidized and who gets reduced. Now back up to the top here, the organic compounds in respiration are carbohydrates, proteins, or fats, right? And those carbohydrates, proteins, and fats that you eat when you in your diet can be broken down into two key substrates for respiration. The first one, and as I put here, the primary one, is glucose. Right, C6H12O6. Now, sometimes we would convert things into a glucose phosphate, which is the same thing, just with a phosphate group attached. As you'll see, that's one of the steps along the pathway here in metabolism anyways. So the major focus is that we're going to start with glucose. And if you eat carbohydrates or you break down some of your stored glycogen sugar in your body, you're just going to break that sugar down into glucose, the simplest monomer. If we're talking about lipids or proteins, amino acids, they're going to be converted into similar substrates, and we'll come back and look at that later and see where those proteins and lipids really enter into respiration. For now, our focus is the carbohydrates. So now back to a question that I posed at the very beginning, which is, why do we need ATP for this process? Why can't we use other sources of energy? Now, scientists figured out a long time ago that if all the energy in a glucose monomer was released all at once, right, the resulting energy blast would be way too big for your cell to efficiently harness that energy. So if we just oxidize glucose in one big step, so much energy would be given off and only a tiny bit would be used by the cell. The rest of it would probably be lost as heat. Now, this is what you see in a combustion reaction if you light something on fire, right? Pretty much all of the energy in that case is being lost to the environment as heat and light. There's a picture up here of an explosion. I had a college professor who really had a couple different ways of explaining respiration and why you need ATP. The first concept was, if you look at a car, it has an internal combustion engine. What is really happening a couple feet in front of you in a car under the hood in that engine is that it is combusting a little tiny drop of gasoline, basically one at a time. Now it's doing that in a very controlled way so that you don't get an explosion with every drop of gasoline, but it uses these tiny little amounts of gasoline and combusts them and harnesses the energy to make the car go. That is what your cells do with glucose. They break down the glucose through a series of steps into tiny little packets of energy that the cell can harness and use, and these tiny little packets are ATP. Now, if the cell tried to do it all in one step, it would end up looking like this picture. And this picture is what you get if you try to combust an entire tank of gasoline at one time. So if you take a match and toss it in your gas tank, your car's going to explode, and all that gas is going to combust, and you're going to lose all that energy as heat and light. But if you control that reaction, like your engine does, you can harness more of that energy. Now, the other example, which I would have done with you if I was in class today, so this is disappointing, is to try to take a drink from a fire hydrant, is what my college professor used to say. Now, what I like to do is just spray somebody in class with water from the sink. If you take a controlled sip of water from a glass, all of that water hopefully gets into your mouth and you can swallow it down and you've got all that water, or in the case of ATP, that energy. But if you try to take a drink from like a water fountain out in the hallway, how much of that water actually goes right past your mouth and your face and goes down the drain? A whole bunch. All right, what our professor said is, imagine what it looks like when a fire hose is shooting off, and then try to drink from that. Right? Yeah, you'll probably get some water in your mouth, but the majority of it is going to knock you down and go flying all over the place and everywhere else. Same thing again with a cell. If it tries to take that glucose and oxidize it at once, most of that energy is lost from the cell. A tiny bit will get harnessed, but most of it's gone. But instead, we can take away electrons very slowly and methodically from glucose and couple that with producing these little packets of ATP energy, which we can then use in our cell. So here is cellular respiration, an overview slide. Don't get too worried about learning this slide because we're going to hit this stuff as we move through the rest of this set of notes. But these are the three major steps of respiration. Respiration always begins with glycolysis, no matter if it is aerobic or anaerobic. Glycolysis is where we start with glucose, a 6-carbon sugar. We oxidize that and break it into 2 different 3-carbon substrates, and this produces a little bit of ATP for our cells. Now then we go on to step 2. right? And step 2 is determined by whether the cell is doing aerobic respiration or anaerobic. If the cell is anaerobic, we'll start here. Then step 2 is fermentation, which is a very simple way to continue the breakdown of the sugar, and as we'll see next class, feed some energy kind of back into the system so we can start over. If you are doing aerobic respiration, then you're going to do the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is a little more complicated. It's where we're going to break down those 3 carbon substrates that came from glycolysis, completely just turn them into carbon dioxide that you can exhale from your body, and in the process make some more ATP. Then that takes us to step 3 if we're doing aerobic respiration. So basically aerobic is 3 steps: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Anaerobic is only 2 steps: glycolysis and fermentation. Now the electron transport chain is what it sounds like. It's a series of proteins that can pass electrons from one step to the next. When they do that, they're able to release more energy from what we started with. At the end of the chain, we're going to hand those electrons off to oxygen, which we refer to as the final electron acceptor. That oxygen forms water, which is our other product in this reaction, and then energy is released in the form of lots of ATP. And so this electron transport chain is where we make the majority of our cellular ATP. Now, a little bit of background. First, where does this take place? Now, parts of respiration just take place in the cytosol. If that's true, you realize we can see it in eukaryotes or prokaryotes. Right? Other parts of aerobic respiration take place inside the mitochondria, which we learned back in chapter 4 is like the power center of your cell, right? It's where all the energy comes from with aerobic respiration. Now, realize inherent in that is the idea that aerobic respiration can only really take place in eukaryotes, right? Because prokaryotes don't have mitochondria. So, glycolysis and fermentation, here in my ghetto PowerPoint drawn slide, glycolysis and fermentation take place in the cytosol. Then, if we are going to do aerobic respiration, the products of glycolysis have to go all the way inside the matrix of the mitochondria, which is where the Krebs cycle takes place, all the way in that inner compartment. And then the electron transport chain takes place within this inner mitochondrial membrane. So the proteins that are involved in the electron transport chain are actually embedded in that inner mitochondrial membrane. Now, second thing, who is involved in cellular respiration? Now, we already saw glucose. We said that in glycolysis, glucose will get split into 2 3-carbon substrates. Those are called pyruvates. So kind of your starting point is glucose and pyruvate. Now, another big player that we need to talk about for a minute is the electron carriers. Again, what we're really doing when we oxidize this sugar is oxidation is lost, so the sugar loses electrons, and those electrons need to get other places. So inside your cells, you have electron carriers. These are technically coenzymes that can carry electrons and also the protons that stay with them from one part of respiration to the electron transport chain. Now, the first one, and the primary one that we'll talk about the most, is NAD+. NAD+ can pick up an electron, gain an electron, get reduced. And when it gets reduced, it becomes NADH. So in your cell, you've got a bunch of these electron carriers that switch back and forth between being NAD+ and NADH. NAD+ is an empty carrier, and NADH is a full carrier. And when we say that, we mean no electrons or full of electrons. Basically, NAD+ can pick up 2 electrons and then deliver them to the electron transport chain. And it can do this very efficiently. Don't lose a lot of the energy that's in those electrons when we do this. often describe NAD plus, NADH like a moving van or a truck, right? NAD plus is an empty truck. You fill it up with electrons and it becomes NADH. It drops those electrons off wherever they need to go and it empties back out. We can reuse it again. Now FADH2 is another electron carrier. Works just like NAD plus and NADH. The only difference is that it is involved in the Krebs cycle. And so we'll see it later on. And it can carry 2 electrons where they need to go as well. Final player that we need to know for now is ATP, right? The form of cellular energy that we are trying to make in this process. Now, this slide we'll keep coming back to as we move through things here. But there are 2 ways to get ATP. And both of those is a phosphorylation, or a type of phosphorylation. We saw this back in the last unit with cell signaling, phosphorylation to add a phosphate. So when we make ATP, we take ADP, adenosine diphosphate, we add a phosphate to it, and that gives us ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. So there's 2 different ways that your cell, in respiration at least, will make ATP. The first one is referred to as oxidative phosphorylation. This is responsible for 90% of the ATP that we're going to produce. And oxidative phosphorylation takes place along with the electron transport chain at the end of respiration. So we'll add more details to that concept later on. Basically, it takes place using this big enzyme, which you see pictured here that we'll talk about later. Now, we also have a second thing called substrate level phosphorylation. This is responsible for a much smaller amount of ATP production. And substrate level phosphorylation takes place during the earlier stages of respiration, so glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. Substrate level phosphorylation occurs when an enzyme takes a phosphate off of something else and adds it to ATP. It's kind of like if we take a phosphate off of something, we need somewhere to put it. And so where the cell will put it is on ADP, forming this ATP energy on the side. And so we'll see this happening here over the next couple topics as well. Here's a cool overview picture from your all's textbook that shows cellular respiration. Again, this might be good to review later. Right now, we don't really know that much of this stuff yet, so don't let this slide stress you out. We'll come back to this and look at this later on. But here's our 3 steps, right? Glycolysis, the Krebs cycle is here, and the electron transport chain is here. And in all 3 steps, we're able to make a little bit of ATP, right? Including a lot of ATP here at the end. All right, glycolysis. Now, don't let this slide freak you out either. Okay, this is glycolysis as it is pictured in Dr. Wong's textbook. Dr. Wong's textbook is designed kind of for like a second-year college level. So this picture that you have here is not something that you need to study. Okay, don't study. I'm just trying to make you sweat a little bit. And it involves way more detail than you need. But the reason I show it to you is that so you realize how complicated each of these pathways really is. Glycolysis itself is essentially a 10 chemical reaction pathway, as we change glucose here into 2 pyruvate molecules here. Now, when you're in college, as a second-year student, you would be expected to know what each of these intermediate molecules is. You'd be expected to know the blue enzyme here that's involved in each step. And you'd be expected to know about byproducts and things at each of these steps. We don't need to know that, okay? We're going to really just need to know glucose and the pyruvate and a couple of the things that happen in between. Now, as we said, glycolysis is stage 1. It's the first step in all types of cellular respiration. So here we are again, right? Evolution. Any type of cell on the planet that does any kind of respiration starts with glycolysis. And glycolysis works pretty much the same exact way in every single one of those cells. Now, the goal of glycolysis is to break down our 6-carbon glucose that we start with and snap it in half, turning it into 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. Now, in that process that you just saw, this is going to take multiple chemical reaction steps, And within those steps, we're going to make a little bit of ATP by a substrate level phosphorylation. And we're going to pick up a couple of electrons with our electron carrier and fill up a couple of our NADH moving trucks. Now, we break glycolysis for our purposes into two phases. The first four reactions that you saw in the last slide are what we're going to refer to as the energy investment phase. This requires an input of 2 ATP. Remember, no reaction can happen without getting over that hill, if you can think back to those enzyme diagrams we saw. So we have to get some energy in here to get things started. And so the first part of it is our energy investment. We use 2 ATP to start off this process. Now then we have the remaining reactions 5 through 9, are going to be what we refer to as our energy payoff phase. This energy payoff, these reactions are going to generate 4 ATP and also generate 2 of these filled up electron carrying NADHs. So let's look at the energy investment phase with a much more simple picture here and a much more simple approach. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take our glucose and we're going to burn up or use 2 ATP molecules right here to form an intermediate called fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So we're basically going to add or use 2 ATPs to add phosphate to the glucose. And when we do that, it's going to change its shape a little bit too. So if you look at this name, fructose, different sugar, right? It's because we've changed the shape. And then 1,6-bisphosphate. The bi or bis means 2. And the 1 and the 6 are carbons within the molecule. So like we number the carbons, right? So if you look at this thing right here, it still has 6 carbons. Now there's a phosphate added to the first carbon and the 6th carbon. So that's fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Now, fructose 1,6-bisphosphate then breaks up. Basically, by adding those phosphates, we destabilize this sugar and it breaks in half because it's not stable anymore. What it becomes are 2 molecules referred to as glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates, or sometimes we call them G3Ps. Right? Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates. So there's a 3-carbon mini sugar with a phosphate attached. Now, same picture up here, just moving on down the line. The energy payoff phase, where we're going to actually make a little ATP, is this lower part of the diagram, part C and D, as is pictured here on the illustration. Each of our 2 G3Ps, so we got this side of the reaction and we got this side of the reaction, is going to go through the same process now. And it's going to go through some changes, and that G3P is going to be turned into a 3-carbon product called pyruvate. And pyruvate is what we make at the end here of glycolysis. Now, as the G3P turns into pyruvate, it's going to take multiple reactions, but all I want you to know is that you're going to make an NADH, so you're going to fill up one of those electron carriers, and you're going to produce 2 ATP for each pyruvate. So if we look at both sides, right, our total production in glycolysis from one glucose molecule is 4 ATP, 2 from each side of this reaction, and 2 NADH, 1 from each side of this reaction. But what we're often asked about is the net totals for glycolysis. And what we say is that glycolysis makes 2 NADH, that's exactly what we saw here above, but it makes 2 ATP, and that's because of the energy investment stage. Right? We're going to make 4, but we had to burn 2 to get started. So we have sort of a profit or a net total of 2 ATP. Now what I can tell you is that that is weak. Right? That is very little ATP that you can get from glycolysis. So when you are a massive eukaryotic multicellular organism like us, you're going to need another way to make ATP. And you're going to need a lot more of it. And that's what these later stages of respiration are all about. So this takes care of stage 1, glycolysis, We still have to work our way through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and we have to make our way onto the other side and look at the anaerobic process of fermentation. So I know it's a lot. This is more detail than you've seen in the past from freshman year or from being in the Bio 2 class. And what I want you to know right now, I want to hopefully can put your mind at ease a little bit, is that I don't think you know this right now. Okay? This stuff is going to need a lot of repetition. It's going to need looking through the chapter. It's going to need going through these notes a lot. It's going to require talking about this in class a lot and taking different approaches and angles with it. And that's exactly what we're going to do. But we're going to get all of you guys to a point where you know this stuff. And that's going to give you an edge on that national exam. Because when the time comes, I'm really confident that other high school kids aren't going to learn it as well as you're going to learn it. And that's going to give you that extra couple points that you need maybe to beat those other competitors on the real AP test. So hopefully this did not make your head explode. Start to work on that first worksheet. Start to read through this chapter, and we'll just keep getting the repetition so that we can learn this stuff. I'll see you guys soon.